In 1894, Marshall McCully built a house out of dirt. It was supposed to be temporary. Most sod houses fell apart within a decade, their walls cracking as the roots dried and died. McCully expected to tear it down as soon as he could afford lumber. 69 years later, the lumber house burned to the ground. McCully was 95. He walked across his property, stepped through the door of the dirt house he'd built as a young man, and moved back in. It's still standing 130 years later. To understand why, you have to go back to a land run, a quarter in his pocket, and a choice his wife made about the floor. The Cherokee Outlet. Land run of September 16, 1893, remains the largest in American history. 6 million acres, all of it Cherokee land until the government bought them out. By that September, and the money had changed hands, the surveyors had done their work, and all that was left was to fire the starting gun. The rules were simple enough. You lined up at the border, waited for the signal at high noon, then raced into the territory to find a plot of unclaimed land and drive a stake into the ground. If you got there first, 160 acres belonged to you. The Homestead Act asked for 5 years of your life. Live on the land, build a dwelling, make improvements. Do that, and the government handed you a patent, legal ownership of a quarter section of American soil. Free land, the last of it. After this run, there would be no more. More than 100,000 people gathered at the starting line. Some had horses, some had wagons, some had bicycles. A few had paid railroad companies for spots on special land-run trains that would carry them deeper into the territory faster than any horse could run. They waited in the September heat, watching the horizon, waiting for the gun. Marshall McCully arrived with everything he owned: a 2-wheeled cart, a team of horses, his bedroll, some food his mother had packed, and 25 cents in his pocket. He was 26 years old. 8 years of logging in Washington state, felling trees in the wet forests of the Pacific Northwest, and this was all he had to show for it. He'd saved what little a laborer could save, waiting for a chance like this one. At noon, the signal fired, and 100,000 people surged forward at once. Horses screamed, wagons overturned in the crush, and dust rose so thick the horizon disappeared. And some riders trampled men on foot without slowing down. People died in that chaos, though no one kept count. McCully pushed his team hard through it, found a plot he liked, and drove his stake. Then another man appeared who'd gotten there first. The claim was disputed, officials got involved, and McCully lost. 8 years of work in the timber camps, and he was back to nothing. He could have gone home. Plenty of men did. But McCully filed on a second plot, a parcel in what would become Alfalfa County, 4 miles north of a town called Clio Springs that didn't exist yet. It wasn't his first choice, but the outlet was vast, and not every quarter section had been claimed in the initial frenzy. The land was flat and treeless, covered in buffalo grass so dense the roots formed a mat 4 inches thick. Yet nothing but grass and sky in every direction. McCully had no money for lumber, no money for nails or milled boards. The nearest timber was days away by wagon, and even if he could afford it, he'd have nothing left for seed or tools. But he had land. On the treeless prairie, the land itself would have to be the building material. When the Homestead Act pushed Americans onto the Great Plains, they encountered what explorer Stephen Long had labeled the Great American Desert. Grass as far as you could see, almost no trees. Lumber that cost pennies back east cost fortunes here, hauled hundreds of miles by wagon or rail. A single glass window could eat up half the budget for an entire house. The settlers looked down at the grass beneath their feet and saw something else. buffalo grass, big blue stem, and slough grass had root systems that had been growing and dying for 10,000 years, tangled into a mat so thick it could be cut into blocks and stacked like bricks. They called it Nebraska marble. A simple soddy could be built in about a week for less than $5. And they worked in their way. Cool in summer, warm in winter. They could take a prairie fire without burning and survive tornadoes that flattened frame buildings. McCully spent his first winter in a dugout carved into the side of a ravine, with packed dirt walls and a canvas roof stretched over wooden poles. It was dark, damp, and cramped, barely tall enough to stand in. When the wind came across the prairie at night, the canvas snapped, and the cold found its way through every gap. He was alone out there, miles from his nearest neighbor, as with nothing to do but wait for spring. But it kept the worst of the winter off, and he worked odd jobs across the Kansas border through the winter of 1893 to 94, saving every cent for what came next. By spring, he had enough to start building something real. In August 1894, when the summer heat had baked the prairie firm, he started cutting sod. He used a 14-inch breaking plow hitched to his horses, cutting strips of prairie grass 12 inches wide and 4 inches deep. The buffalo grass roots held each strip together like rough masonry. He chopped them into 18-inch bricks, loaded them onto his cart, and hauled them a mile back to the building site. Back and forth, load after load, day after day. Each brick weighed about 150 pounds. One rule governed the work. You only cut what you could lay that day. Sod bricks had to be stacked while still damp, and if they dried out before you placed them, they crumbled apart, and the day's labor was wasted. McCully fell into a rhythm, cutting in the morning, hauling and stacking through the afternoon, resting at night. Day after day, the walls rose, 2 bricks thick, grass side down, staggered so the joints wouldn't line up. He left gaps for a door on the south side and 2 windows, and when the walls reached 7 feet, he laid split wooden poles across the top. Timber he'd hauled from far east of his property where trees grew along the creek bottoms, then covered them with another foot of sod. The roof alone weighed 7,000 pounds. Those wooden poles had to hold. The finished house measured 12 by 25 feet, divided into 2 rooms by an interior sod wall. At most frontier soddies were single rooms with blankets as dividers, so 2 actual rooms was a luxury. The exterior walls stood 18 inches thick. All told, McCully cut and stacked roughly half an acre of living prairie. 96 tons of earth, grass, and root transformed into a dwelling. The sod itself cost nothing. His real expense would depend on a choice that wasn't his to make. While McCully was building, he was courting a woman named Sadie. She agreed to marry him and join him on the claim, but McCully faced a problem every homesteader knew. Money only stretched so far. He could afford glass windows or a wood floor. Not both. Glass had to be shipped from Wichita, Kansas, fragile cargo hauled over rough trails for days. A single pane could cost more than a week's wages, and most sod houses made do with oiled paper stretched over the window gaps, letting in murky light but keeping out the wind. Real glass meant real light, clear views of the prairie, something like civilization. A wood floor meant tongue and groove planks fitted over joists, a barrier between your feet and the packed earth. Most soddies had dirt floors that turned to mud when it rained, bred fleas and sprouted weeds after every storm. Women spent hours sweeping only to have grass shoots push through again after the next rain. A wood floor meant you could sweep and scrub, that you could feel like you weren't living inside the ground. McCully gave Sadie the choice: light or cleanliness, windows or floor. She chose the floor. He installed wood planking in 1895, and the following year their daughter Letha was born inside those walls. Yes, McCully kept working, taking sharecropping jobs across the Kansas border, and eventually saved enough for glass windows too. Light poured in. The soddy was becoming a home. Sadie's days were filled with the work of keeping a household running in the middle of nowhere. Hauling water from the well, cooking over the cast-iron stove, mending clothes, tending the garden. The nearest neighbor was a long walk away. When McCully left for work across the Kansas line, she was alone with the baby and the wind and the grass that stretched to the horizon. But she had her floor. She could scrub it clean, and it stayed clean. But sod houses were temporary. Everyone knew this. The roof leaked for days after heavy rains, as water seeped through the sod and dripped mud onto everything below. Women stretched flour sacks across ceilings to catch the drips, yet creating a kind of indoor tent that sagged with dirty water. Insects burrowed through the walls, beetles and centipedes emerging from the grass roots that still held the bricks together. Snakes found their way inside, hunting the mice that nested in the sod, and the ceiling cloth was as much for catching falling snakes as falling dirt. Florence Murphy Dowse, from a Nebraska sod house family, remembered that she hated snakes, and she had to deal with them all the time. The walls themselves were dying from the moment they were stacked. Without living roots drawing water, the bricks dried and cracked and crumbled. Most soddies lasted 6 or 7 years. A well-maintained one might stretch to 20. McCully's would last 130. He did something different, something that seemed insignificant at the time. A few miles west of McCully's claim, the soil changed. Pale, chalky, bitter with mineral salts. The alkali flats, remnants of ancient seabeds left behind when prehistoric lakes evaporated thousands of years ago. Worthless for farming. Crops wouldn't grow in it, and animals avoided the alkaline pools. McCully hauled cartloads of this alkali clay back to his soddy, mixed it with water, and spread it across the interior walls, load after load, the same way he'd hauled the sod bricks. His reasoning was practical. The salty coating deterred insects and vermin. Bugs wouldn't burrow through it, and mice and snakes avoided the bitter taste. He was solving the pest problem that plagued every sod house on the plains. The plaster was also preserving the walls from the inside out, though McCully had no way of knowing that. And here's what kills a sod house: water. When the walls get wet, they swell. When they dry out, they shrink. Do that enough times over enough seasons, and the whole thing cracks apart. The alkali clay formed a mineral shell that held the moisture steady inside the wall, slowing that cycle down to almost nothing. The plaster also bound the decomposing roots into something approaching adobe. As the organic material broke down over the years, the mineral coating held everything in place. The walls weren't just dirt anymore, they were becoming primitive concrete. Renee Trindle, the curator of the Sod House Museum, puts it simply: the plaster is the main reason the sod house has survived so long. McCully wasn't building for posterity. He was trying to keep the bugs out. In solving one problem, he accidentally solved another. But the plaster alone wouldn't have saved the house. Sadie died in 1902 at 32 years old. Frontier death records rarely gave details, listing causes like fever or consumption, or simply declined. What mattered was that the woman who had chosen the floor, who had given birth to Letha inside these walls, who had made the soddy feel like a home, was gone. On December 31, 1903, a decade after the land run, Marshall McCully received his official land patent from the United States government. 5 years of continuous residence, improvements to the land, proof of cultivation. The quarter section was legally his, and no one could dispute his claim now. That date would matter again, 60 years later. McCully raised his daughter alone in the sod house, doing what needed to be done to keep the place standing. Letha was 6 when her mother died. For the next 5 years, it was just the two of them in that house. McCully doing the work Sadie used to do while also running the farm. The house held. In 1907, 5 years after Sadie's death, McCully remarried. His new wife Pearl became pregnant almost immediately, and she made her position clear. She would not give birth in a soddy. McCully built a frame house, milled lumber, a real foundation, multiple rooms with doors that latched, windows that didn't let in snakes. Their daughter Luvisa would later recall that her parents hurried the building so I wouldn't have to be born in a soddy. Pearl's pregnancy drove the construction timeline, and the frame house went up fast. The family moved in 1909. After 15 years as the center of their lives, the soddy became storage, a chicken hatchery, and a playhouse for the children. It sat a few hundred feet from the frame house, visible from the kitchen window, settling into its role as something left behind. The proper house stood nearby with its wood and glass, everything the soddy wasn't. For more than half a century, the McCully family lived in that frame house. Children grew up, moved away, started families of their own. Pearl grew old there. The frame house was where real life happened now. But McCully kept maintaining the soddy, patching the roof, checking the plaster, keeping the fence intact so cattle wouldn't rub against the walls. That last part mattered more than most people realize. David Murphy, an architect who has studied sod houses for 50 years, found that cattle rubbing against walls is the single fastest way to destroy a soddy. After that comes roof failure, poor drainage, and wind erosion. The McCully house avoided all of them because someone kept caring for it even after the family moved out. Year after year, decade after decade, the walls held. Then, 54 years later, the frame house caught fire. The wooden house burned, the proper one, the one Pearl had insisted upon, gone. McCully walked across his property and moved back into the soddy. He was 95 years old. The house he'd built as temporary shelter in 1894, the one his second wife refused to give birth in, had served as a storage shed and chicken coop for 54 years. Chickens had roosted where Sadie once cooked supper. Tools had piled up in the corner where Letha's crib had been. But the walls were still solid. The floor Sadie chose was still there, under the dust and the debris. The replacement, the upgrade, the permanent home, was ash. He died there in 1963, inside the same structure he'd built 69 years earlier. Born in 1867, he had witnessed the entire arc of the homesteading era, from the land runs to the space age. He spent his final days in a house made of dirt, on a floor his first wife had chosen, before his second wife was even part of the story. Exactly 60 years to the day after he received his land patent, the Oklahoma Historical Society acquired the property. December 31st, 1903, and December 31st, 1963. The symmetry is real. The McCully sod house now sits inside a climate-controlled protective building 4 miles north of Clio Springs, near the town of Aleen, Oklahoma. The protective structure was built around the original house without moving it an inch. The soddy remains in its exact original location, on the same plot McCully claimed in 1893. It is the only original homesteader-built sod house still standing in Oklahoma, listed on the National Register of Historic Places since 1970. The Oklahoma Historical Society operates the site as the Sod House Museum. The wood floor Sadie chose is still there, worn smooth by decades of footsteps, along with the original cast-iron stove McCully used for heating and cooking, and the 14-inch sod plow he cut the bricks with, all preserved alongside the structure they helped create. In 2021, a bronze statue of McCully was installed at the museum entrance. A young man frozen before everything began, before Sadie, before Pearl, before the fire, before the return. He was one of hundreds of thousands. Between 1860 and 1910, settlers built sod houses across the Great Plains, and they lived in them because they had to, and abandoned them as soon as they could afford to. Almost all of those houses are gone now. The handful that survive are mostly reconstructions, museum pieces built to show tourists what the originals looked like. The originals rotted and collapsed and were plowed under. The McCully house is different. It's the real thing. The same walls, the same floor, the same roof timbers hauled from the eastern woodlands, built when there was nothing on that prairie but grass and sky. And a 26-year-old man with a quarter in his pocket, who'd just lost his first claim and had to settle for his second choice. When the better things burned down, the thing that was never supposed to last was still there. You can still walk on the floor Sadie chose.